Hello there everybody, Sam Strains here, welcome back to the Railway and welcome back to another video. Now a few weeks ago when I was reviewing this, the brand new Bachmann E1, or J72 if you want to call it that, I realised something truly fascinating about these, and it's that I'm going to talk about today. So we all know that the latest J72 here is Bachmann's newest model. But did you also know that the J72 is Bachmann's oldest model as well? So we have this one here. This is the very first steam locomotive that CADA, that's Bachmann's manufacturer, ever produced. So this one here was made all the way back in 1976. That was the first time it was released, which means that there's a difference of about 43 years between these two models. So I thought, you know, until Bachmann actually release a new steam locomotive, it's absolutely true that both the newest and the oldest models are one and the same. So that was a perfect opportunity. I thought, why don't we take a look at these two models and see how model railways have changed over that 40 odd year time span, and just see how things have developed over that time. So hopefully this is going to be really interesting. Let's talk about the first major difference that I'm sure most of you are wondering about, and that is the price. So let's talk first about this really old one. When it was first released under Mainline, I cannot find the price for it. I don't know how much it cost initially. However, I did find a Mainline pricing catalogue or something like that from 1981, and the price for this all those years ago was £12.50. Now obviously that sounds ridiculously cheap, although it's not quite fair to compare that £12.50 with the £110 I spent on the latest model, because of course there's been inflation since then. However, I have converted that £12.50 into modern money, and that still reaches about £52, so it's still an awful lot cheaper. In fact, it's pretty much exactly half of what I paid for the latest J72. And that on its own speaks volumes about how things have changed. First of all, obviously these models are no longer intended as toys. We're not talking pocket money anymore, are we? We're talking serious money. But it also suggests that there's been a massive increase in manufacturing costs over those years, partly no doubt due to the fact that the complexity of models has increased so much over recent years. Also presumably due to the fact that actual labour costs and shipping costs and materials and all that have shot up as well. But also it probably reflects demand. I mean, are these things as popular as they were back in the 1970s? I would say not. So if a manufacturer expects to sell less of a model, that would explain why the prices had to go up in order to cover the cost of manufacturer. So some interesting stuff to think about just by looking at the price. But now let's take a look at some of the details and see how the actual models themselves have changed. So the first major difference that I was expecting to see between these two models was that of scale and size. Obviously these days models are designed on computers, which means that the margin for human error is reduced drastically, and some manufacturers can even go and scan the real locomotive where possible so that they get an absolute representation of the real thing. Back in the 1970s, of course, though, there was nothing like that. It would probably be more a case of tape measure in hand, design the thing by eye, or if they were really lucky, they might get diagrams of the original thing so that they get the dimensions. Either way, though, I was expecting to see quite a lot of difference in the size of these two models, but amazingly, that's not really the case. If I line up their front buffer beams, you can see that all of the major components basically line up absolutely perfectly. The water tanks start in exactly the same place, the cabs line up perfectly, even the back of the coal bunkers just about line up really close, which means that even back in the 1970s, they were getting these things pretty much right. As I say, we take that for granted today with all the computer design, but back in the 70s when they didn't really have that, that is really quite impressive. There are some differences. If I get down really low, you can see the running plate is quite a lot higher on that old Bachmann/Mainline version. However, even though the proportions are roughly the same, there are quite a lot of differences when it comes to the actual details. So the first of those differences we'll talk about is the paintwork. Now it's worth saying that even though this model on the right here, the old one, was designed back in the 1970s, my example was produced back in 2008, so that one is barely 10 years old, which means that some features of it are a little bit more modern than they ought to be, and one of those aspects is definitely the paintwork. However, you can still see that there are massive differences between the two. So on the brand new E1 or J72, you can see that the accuracy in the lining there, particularly on the boiler, is absolutely top notch. The old version is still okay, but you can see that the accuracy isn't quite as good. There's a few areas that are a little bit questionable. And generally speaking, on later models, lining is a little bit finer as well. So as you can see, if we look at the lining here along the running plate and on the steps, and also around the glazed windows, you can see that when we compare it to the old version, they are worlds apart, aren't they? That's not so fine at all on the old version, particularly around the steps. You can see the lining is a lot thicker, which does suggest huge improvements in sort of printing technology, I suppose. Now let's take a look at some of the details. On the old original Mainline J72, the cab is basically non-existent. There is a tiny bit of space inside there, but there's certainly no detail of any kind. In fact, most of the area there is taken up with the split chassis. On the latest model, that could not be further from the truth. As you can see, we have a beautifully detailed cab there. On the new version, we also have valve gear represented between the frames, which is a beautiful feature. As you can see, nothing like that at all on the original version there. And once again, you can see the split chassis, and that's something very noticeable. You can only see the chassis on the modern version, really, when you're supposed to be able to. Not the case with the old one. It's visible in quite a few ugly areas, including underneath the coal bunker where there's a big screw visible. No, it's much more realistic on the later version. We also have things like lamp irons on the modern version, which are just tiny little details. Whether or not they were not present on the LNER version, because of course this one here is LNER, this one's NER, there are going to be some differences because historically these are modelled a few years apart. But yeah, it doesn't have lamp irons, and I assume it probably would have done in real life. So while there are quite a lot of details that the modern version has that the old one didn't, obviously a lot of the details are the same, but the modern version has a bit more finesse. So if we take a look at the smoke boxes side by side, you can see that the handle there on the left hand side is separately fitted, whereas the old one was just a part of the moulding. Very noticeable that. There are things like metal safety valves, as you can see on the latest version there, nice shiny metal safety valves, which look a lot better than the original plastic moulded safety valves, which don't have that metallic shine to them, and you can see that they're a little bit rougher looking, aren't they? Obviously, the old version has buffers, but those are not sprung. Once again, not true with the latest version. We do have fully sprung buffers on there, which is a bit of a frivolous feature, but it just shows the kind of detail that modern manufacturers are capable of. I would argue that the finesse on the latest model isn't always better though. If we take a look at the wheel set, I would say that the wheels on the original Mainline version do look a lot better, partly probably because of the way they were assembled, but as you can see, we can't see the axles, the ends of the axles on the original version, whereas we can on the new one. They look a lot worse. So while for the most part the new one is leaps and bounds ahead, the old one does still have it in a few tiny areas. So now then, let's move on and talk about the differences between the features of these two models, and for that we'll need to get the bodies off. So I'll do that and I'll come back to you in just a sec. So here we have two naked chassis on display for you. The one on the left is the latest one, the one on the right is the much older one. The first interesting difference to talk about then is the weight, because when fully assembled, the older model is much heavier than the newer model. So when fully assembled, the old model weighs in at 223 grams, whereas the new one weighs in at 176 grams, which is very interesting given that this old one here cost half as much money. But the differences in weight don't stop there, because this old model here, most of the weight for that loco is in the chassis. The chassis itself on the old version weighs 210 grams, an awful lot of weight. And the body, just a plastic body, is very light indeed. It weighs in at 13 grams. Now that's completely different with the new version because the weight is half and half. The chassis itself weighs in at 89 grams, so that's interesting, but the body weighs nearly as much. The body weighs 88 grams. The reason for that being that it's not all made of plastic. We actually have this die-cast metal running board, which, as you know, weighs quite a bit. Also, with the old version, the way that the bodies were attached was very crude. As you can see, there are two metal painted lugs on the chassis which fit into great big gaping holes in the loco body. Obviously though, these days that wouldn't be acceptable with that desire for detail and accuracy, and so there's nothing like that. As you can see, it's much more nicely done. It's all done with screws. Besides that though, let's talk about the actual mechanical differences between these two chassis. Let's talk about the old version first. So this is incredibly simple stuff. There's very, very little to it. It's basically two massive lumps of metal, and they're just screwed together, as you can see with these holes. And you can in fact see that there's a big crack all the way down the center. This is what's known as a split chassis model. The two halves are completely isolated, and all that happens is the left wheels touch the left half, the right wheels touch the right half, and those are insulated by a plastic spacer, as you can see, which often fail and cause the locos to break down. But that's how it works. So the left half of the chassis is live to the left track, the right half of the chassis is live to the right, and then the motor just sits in between. One half of the motor touches one half of the chassis, the other terminal on the motor touches the other half of the chassis, and it just runs. That's all there is to it. It's just a motor and it's just wheels. Now, take a look at this. This is a complete world apart. So this is not just two hunks of metal, it's a single lovely chassis. We have actual pickups on the wheels, which are a little bit less reliable than split chassis, but it does mean that the chassis itself isn't live to the track, which means that we can have this circuit board here, which has a DC-C socket on board, nothing like that with the old version, so we can chip these later models if we want to. The motor, as you can see, is a lot smaller. I think this is a coreless motor. I still didn't find out for sure. But as you can see, yeah, it's a lot more compact, and it actually sits inside the smoke box, which is really interesting. We also have a speaker. I mean, who would have thought back in the 1970s that these locos would be making sound? Yeah, crazy, crazy stuff. This one isn't sound fitted, but it does have the speaker. Another interesting feature is underneath here, underneath the circuit board, there are two LEDs, which means that the firebox actually lights up as the thing runs along. Absolutely incredible stuff. Nothing like that on the old version. And as you can see, the couplings on the old version, even though these look like they're NEM, they're actually not. So you can't exchange these. They're actually just screwed to the chassis. And because they're screwed on very tightly, you can see there's no movement whatsoever in those. Very different again with the modern version. These are NEM couplings, which means you can take them out entirely very easily if you want to, or you can fit a different type of coupling. And they're beautifully pivoted as well, look. So on curves, the coupling can follow any rolling stock, which is great. So, completely different, aren't they? Entirely different. In fact, this is the area in which they differ the most. It is worth saying that this is even an improved version of the original mainline chassis. The original mainline chassis was a lot more dodgy. It had a different motor in it, which I don't like very much. This was upgraded, but even so, you can tell that the two are entirely different. So, now that we've had a good look inside, let's talk about the actual performance. On paper, this thing is much, much nicer. But is it much nicer on the actual track? Well, the result might surprise you. Let's give it a go. Okay, so we have both examples now down onto the track, and let's be honest, at the end of the day, they both look beautiful, don't they? At the end of the day, they both do their job, really, as entertainment pieces, don't they? Obviously, though, with such different weights and such different mechanisms, there have to be differences in the performance, although, as I say, they might not be what you expect. So, as the considerably heavier loco, the old Bachmann J72 is the better puller. This one weighs in at 0.36 newtons of pulling force, and that means it can haul about 23 coaches, which is much, much more than the new Bachmann E1 or J72, which only hauls 0.22 newtons of pulling force, which is equal to about 16 coaches. So you might be thinking, oh my goodness, that's a huge difference. The old one is way better than the new one, although that's not strictly true, because don't forget, back in the 1970s when these were made by Mainline, they were considered toys. And as toys, the wagons and coaches could not have metal wheels. It was deemed too dangerous. And so instead they were all fitted with plastic wheels, which had loads more drag, and so the engines had to be more powerful in order to manage them. These days, models are designed strictly for adults, really, and all of the rolling stock these days has metal wheels, much less drag. So really, in the 1970s, and here we are in 2020s, these two locos are probably similarly capable with rolling stock from the respective eras. So pulling force is very different, but how different is the actual slow speed? Well, let's start off with the old one and see how slow it can run without cutting out. So let me set this one to forwards and we will give it a go. So I'm easing it up very, very gently on the controller, and as soon as it starts to move, I'm going to let go and we'll see how slow it can run. Okay, I can see it moving. Can we call that stable? Yes, we can. So there we go. store that in your mind. That is the slow speed of the old one. And as you can see, it's wonderful, unbelievably so. Despite how dated the mechanism is, despite all the friction of not having proper bearings, it's still able to do such an amazing crawl. So there we go, store that in your mind. Now let's take a look at the latest J72, or the E1 as it's properly known. Okay, set that one to forwards, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'm going to look closely and slowly start to turn it up. Here we go. Right, that's when it's kicked in. As you can see, it's not as slow and it's not as reliable. Look, that's stopped already. There we are. I would say that's about as slow as the Bachmann old version was, but it's not as confident, is it? It will stop, I bet you. You ready? There we go. It's hit another tough spot. So the performance, generally speaking, despite the massive difference, despite the fact that this loco should be way better, the old one wins. It must be said, it's stronger and it's smoother. In fact, I have to speed this up quite a bit more before it becomes stable. There we are. So there we are, that is now stable. Oh, and as you can see, it speeds up and slows down considerably as it goes. Look at that. And it has been running. Unbelievable. And now it's stopped. It's not just cut out on the points though. Yes. So, isn't that funny? Isn't that interesting? Twice as expensive. True, it's got an awful lot more detail. True, it's got a much, much nicer, much more modern mechanism. But at the end of the day, it does not beat the old 1970s, or technically not 1970s, as I say, the mechanism's much newer. But it does not beat the old version. Crazy stuff. So let me know which version is your favourite, and we'll get them both running. I'll put some rolling stock on and get them going. So there they go, beauties. The modern E1 with some modern wagons to suit it, and likewise the old-fashioned version has some plastic-wheeled wagons, which no doubt would have been around at the time. So two completely different models, but as I say, I think they basically have the same function, don't they? They're both going to bring people immeasurable amounts of joy. Hopefully both will last a long while. I mean, it's yet to be seen whether the E1 will last a long while, but the Mainline J72s certainly have been around a while, even though the axles eventually fail. But yes, they both have value, don't they? An awful lot to think about, all those differences in detail, in price, in the different features. It's been absolutely fascinating to think about all this stuff, and I hope you've enjoyed it too. I wasn't expecting them to be quite as interesting and to reveal quite so much, but it definitely proves the value in actually taking these things to pieces and really examining every detail to see how things have changed. And the answer is things have changed, haven't they? Incredibly so. The standard of modern locomotives these days is just astonishing, presumably because modelers these days demand absolute realism, don't they? Which is not a bad thing, of course, but it has brought about a lot of changes. It's brought the prices right up. It's meant that these are not toys anymore, so maybe that's a bad thing. But yeah, overall, very interesting. Good or bad, it's probably too difficult to say that it's either good or bad. But very interesting either way. So let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Thank you very, very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I'll see you soon for another video. Alright folks, take care.